by the patrol resistance?
Thank you very much. And first of all, I should say it's an absolute privilege and a pleasure to be here with all of you at the first shout out to the people, the great people of the great city of Lahore. Let me just make a few comments on what we've been seeing and hearing in the Middle East and North Africa. Because something absolutely extraordinary happened there. That after decades, and in some ways after centuries, of a region not producing very much, not saying very much, suddenly it wasn't just even about resistance. It was about revolutions, about uprisings. And it wasn't just about changing countries' histories, a region's histories. It actually captured the imagination of the entire world. And I know I came to Pakistan when the so-called Arab Spring had kicked off, and people here were asking me about it. You go now through Cairo International Airport, and there's these huge billboards with the German president saying that people in Egypt deserve a Nobel Peace Prize for standing up. And Barack Obama saying on this billboard, at least at a certain point in time, he said, all American children should be educated like Egyptian children. And what was one of the most extraordinary things about that period, which I think is relevant to this kind of a festival, is that among all the rallying cries, and you heard, and I'm sure you've heard and seen them about Hurra, which means freedom, or Karama, which means dignity, one of the most extraordinary ones was, we have lost our fear. And for those, I mean, here in Pakistan, you've known that sense of fear and military dictatorship, at times of great censorship. And in the Middle East and North Africa, we saw it. We didn't just see it on, of course, the bravely confronting the tanks on the streets, bravely and boldly picking up the tear gas canisters and throwing them back, but also, for the first time, in a way that had never happened in the lifetime of so many people, was actually not just speaking, but speaking out. And I think for decades, there will be what Hanif Selma talked about earlier today about the value of hindsight, about trying to understand what really happened. How did this extraordinary series of events begin? We've all heard about the fruit and food vegetable sellers, Mohammad Hanif in Tunisia. I went there not long after he died, and I met his mother. And she was a mother like any Pakistani mother. She was, my son, he was a good boy. He really just wanted to get a job. But instead, when he set himself alight, he set an entire region on fire. Was it, as been said in the media, a Facebook revolution, a Twitter revolution? Sometimes I think that falls into the category, but journalists don't like to admit it's a story that's too good to check. Because everyone wants to believe that it was the power of social media. But of course, history is never so simple, and of course it did play a part. But some of the most important days in Egypt, in Cairo, was when the internet was shut off. So people were forced to leave their computers and go out into the streets. And others, now looking back at that period, say, well, actually, we did see the stirrings of resistance, if you want to call it, of people getting bolder in places like Egypt, for example. A decade before the Arab Spring, so-called Arab Spring, started, you had the extraordinary novel by Ali Dayan Hasan, The Yaqubian Building. And ironically, Ali Dayan is a dentist. And Prince Hassan of Jordan always said, the only time that Arabs open their mouth is when they go to the dentist. But here you had a dentist writing about, and writing in the way that I think a lot of writers across that region had been forced to write for so many years, which is by the use of metaphor, of allegory, of using simple literary techniques to tell or to make some very trenchant criticism. And for those of you who read the book, The Yaqubian Building is a metaphor for Egyptian society, about a corrupt and undemocratic state, about a disenchanted, a restive population. He broke taboos in talking about homosexuality. He was using metaphors in order to do that. And I think just, the last thing I'll say is that if there is a literature of resistance across the Middle East and North Africa, for centuries it has been, there's been some choices for writers. Either you were part of the propaganda machine, you gave in, or you didn't give in and you went to prison, or you used these different techniques, using the historical novel, using the past to criticize the present, using genres like magic realism, as it's called, or science fiction. And so what's happening now with not just bringing down of systems of censorship, bringing down the walls in people's minds, because that is an extraordinary part. And again, people losing their fear. It's people feeling for the first time they can speak out. And the last thing I'll say is just, how do we put ourselves in the shoes of people who have not been able to speak? In Tunisia, for example, these very simple but very profound stories. I'm going to take about people writing on Facebook. How one, it was almost person by person. They'd open up their Facebook and suddenly they'd see someone put, dégage, get out. And you could have gone to prison for that under Zinedine Ben Ali's rule. But suddenly people were saying that. And you think, well, if that person has written that, and he's not in prison, maybe it's okay for me to write that. And it just started until it was dozens of brave activists, then it was hundreds, then it was thousands, then they left their computers and they went out into the streets. And being in Tunis in January of 2011, after Ben Ali went, was a time that I will never forget, because suddenly this elegant Parisian boulevard, Habib Bourguiba Avenue, had been transformed into, we said, a series of Hyde Park corners, where people were discussing and debating in groups. And they would come up to you. You couldn't walk down the street. People would come up to you and say, sorry, I've never been able to talk like this before. Let me tell you what I think. And then midway through the conversation, they would stop in amazement and realizing that for the first time in their life, they'd been able to speak out. And so I guess what I would only say is that, here we are at the Lahore Literary Festival, celebrating, freedom of expression in terms of art and music and media, is to spare a thought for those who don't even have or haven't had that most simple of freedoms of being able to speak, and more importantly, the feeling of being able to speak. Thank you.
I think Lyse has raised some very interesting points. I mean, I think the principal thing that comes across is that, one person's literature is another person's propaganda. And where do you draw the line? What is literary? Is it just the written word that we are talking about? The written word can be an agent for change, but it can be an agent for good change or bad change. And I think that it would be useful, Hanif, if you could dwell on your experiences in Balochistan and documentation, which is what you've done. And do you think that that serves a purpose? Does it serve anything more than an archival purpose? Does it serve as a awareness tool? Or is it like much of the criticism of literature goes, that this is a medium that speaks to the converted? It's preaching to the converted. I'd like you to please dwell on that.
Thanks. It's not working. Is it now? Is it working now? Yes, it is. Okay. Just to add one to sort of this brilliant introduction about Tunisia. And all these people were kind of sitting there putting all this wonderful stuff on Facebook. But not very many were coming out. It was only when the government shut down the internet, and then they didn't have any Facebook to go to, that's when they came out on the streets. Sometimes things can work that way as well. I am one of those hopeless people who think that politics is the only real art, and the rest is all propaganda, everything. Sort of, I read it on a t-shirt once, and that's where I get my wisdom. I think in our context, some few sort of read Urdu newspapers, you might find these stories and they're usually kind of one column, like, sort of 2-inch story, usually sort of buried kind of in the inner pages. And they usually kind of go like, कि नामालूम अफराद ने किसी नामालूम अफराद को उठा के उसको किसी नामालूम जगह पे ले गए, उसके साथ कुछ नामालूम पेड़ जो है उसके बारे में. And that's considered like a sort of an accepted journalistic practice. So I have worked as a journalist long enough, and I've kind of begun to realize at this stage that the most basic form of resistance in our society is to name names. So these people are not namalum people. They have names. They kind of live in a house. They have sort of brothers and sisters and families. And similarly, the people who take them away, those namalum afraad, they also have a kind of sort of, sometimes they have ranks, sometimes they have sort of other ranks. Sometimes they take on kind of names that are not their own names, so it's very difficult to sometimes identify them. But sometimes we clearly know that who these people are and where these people have been taken. So I kind of increasingly think that is the most basic form of resistance in our society. Because for years and years, I was in high school when the first Shia doctor was killed in Ukkada, where I was kind of studying in high school, and it was relatively kind of new phenomenon, and so you can expect that it wasn't mentioned that the doctor was killed was Shia, or the fact that he was killed and sort of have a couple of mosques here. But this has gone on for 30 years now. I think it's only after sort of having killed thousands that you're finally able to kind of say that, those 100 people who died yesterday, actually they were here. And now, then we have people in our society, and they claim that this is their sole aim in life, to kill Shias. I mean, they're not shy about it. It says in their literature, they say it every day in their speeches. And we somehow, especially people in the media, and that's how kind of other people kind of know that what's going on in society, and we refuse to name them. Even when they're sitting there in the middle of your city, thumping their chest, saying that we've been doing this for 30 years, and we will keep doing it unless like all of them are kind of dead or leave the country. So that I think is quite a disturbing attitude. And some of you might remember that not this one, but when the last attack happened on Hazaras, the very next day, a gentleman called Malik Ishaq was giving an address in Karachi, and he said, and these are his words, I quote. He started his speech and he said, आप लोगों को पता है मुझे तकरीर इतनी अच्छी नहीं करनी आती, लेकिन आप लोगों को ये भी पता है कि मुझे कौन सा काम बहुत अच्छी तरह है. And everybody wrote, kind of, and we again, sometimes I get invited on TV talk shows, and as soon as you mention a name, either you are cut off, or it's made sure that you're not called in for like next 3 months, or you're called like on some subject group, you come and talk about literary festivals, or something. And that is my final point. I don't know. Yes, literature, any kind of literature, is a form of resistance. I think even the most rabid right-wing literature that our bookshops are full of, I think that's a form of resistance. That's coming from another side, which we don't get into here. But I was just wondering, kind of not listening to Arundhati Roy's kind of thing, I was just wondering, we've kind of somehow begun to think that literary festivals are a form of resistance as well. I mean, they're very good for writers, otherwise we have no social life. But I don't really know. If it was a form of resistance, then Arundhati Roy would be at every literary festival. She doesn't go. She just sends these video messages. It's nice. Because she knows what is important and what is not. We did that session. You were there in Karachi Literary Festival. about these Baloch missing people, and some of their families were there. It was a kind of a very scary moment, and I was very nervous, but sort of they said whatever they had to say, we talked, and we went home. And later that night, I was thinking, and some of these families were there at the festival speaking. I was thinking that these people have been demanding their brother back, like for 4 years, in some cases for 10 years. And what we are willing to offer them in return is an appearance at a literary festival. That's made me very, very sad.
Thank you, Hanif, for pointing out that the written word or speaking about the written word is not a substitute for action. Which brings us very nicely to Selma Dabbagh, who is a Palestinian writer and who's written a novel, a highly famed novel about the Gaza Strip. Selma, you have, of course, this is one of the most famous struggles in the world, and it is a struggle that has benefited and suffered at the hands of a lot of myth-making and counter-myth-making. Where do you see yourself in this exercise, and what do you think the role of a writer is, or a novelist is, in that sort of situation? Can a novelist actually even bring creative integrity to so fraught a terrain? Or do you just end up, whether you like it or not, positioning yourself on one side of a debate?
Well, thank you for the question, because it really brings up a lot of things I've debated about a lot whilst writing my novel. I'm not just Palestinian, I'm also half English, so I'm a bit of an outsider, which makes my role a lot more tenuous and a lot more fraught with difficulties of a moral and political and soul-searching kind. And I came to literature after a career in law and human rights work, which I became increasingly frustrated with, because you would produce these amazing, factually, verified reports which you would go to London with and present, and you'd look out at the audience and it was all the people that you demonstrated with on Saturday and your friends and your parents. And you couldn't really break out of the groups who were already interested. So what I felt with the novel is that this is a form, because I was always an avid reader and always wanted to write fiction, that I felt that this is a form that can actually transport me to countries that I know nothing about. And then through this entry point, I become more curious about other issues, and I start reading non-fictional works from these countries. So, for example, Guatemala opened up to me through a novel called The Long Night of White Chickens, etc. So this was a feeling I had when I made this shift to literature, was that I could get across to the incurious about an issue. But you have, when you write, your arrogance and your self-doubt, you're constantly dealing with these huge emotions about whether what you will do will have an impact, or if it has an impact, whether it will have the wrong impact, particularly with something so fraught and so full of misrepresentation, such as the Palestinian case. And I think it really, for me, I had to sort of set myself my own little test as to what I needed to do in order to make myself true to my work, but make sure it wasn't irresponsible. You cannot try to present something which is following a party line. You cannot suppress all internal faults. And so I had these kind of tests, one which was a sensitivity in terms of proximity to subject matter and to creating a world which had been real to me, which I wanted to make real to others, and the types of characters who I saw so much strength in, because I felt that if I could export them and to convey them and to make people live in their skins, that it would bring us a freshness of approach to which the media headlines often deaden, to humanize them in a very violent way. And the other was sensitivity, and the other was responsibility, which weighed heavily upon me, because you are so open to be misrepresented. And I I think that can sometimes create perhaps a more cautious work than if you're writing about a less fraught situation. But each writer has to have their own take, and it depends not just on what they're writing about, but when they're writing, because I think sometimes at the beginning part of a revolution, just leading up to it, or an uprising or a revolt, you have a flurry of artistic activity, and probably in the early sort of honeymoon days, again, this is all great, and consciousness building, and everyone feels a collective spirit and they're uplifted by this work. And then afterwards, when it's more problematic, it's much harder for writers to work because they've got problems on their side as well as on the other side, and it's not just a case of it's harder to have a role which is true to yourself. And I think, with Palestinian literature, a lot of it is very great and good, but a lot of what has been translated into English doesn't quite manage to get away from this desire to tell the whole narrative, the whole story, to explain it, because the feeling is that if people understood the whole story, what's happening would not continue.
And that allows us to segue to Kashmir. Kashmir, of course, is dear to our hearts, whether we like it or not. And as we were discussing earlier, the relationship between literature, politics, and propaganda. Certainly, most of us in this audience have, and I exaggerate not, seen perhaps in our lifetimes 10,000 news reports on PTV on Kashmir. So, we do have that kind of a background, if you will, but Basharat Peer brings a very interesting perspective as someone actually who experienced and lived the conflict and who covered it in non-fiction. And I think that what Selma was describing were many of the problems and the crises of a writer writing fiction. Basharat, would you be able to write fiction the way you wrote about Kashmir?
Hello? Yeah. So, yes, I would like to write fiction, but I think I have no imagination. And beyond that, when I was trying to write my first book, and I don't think I ever thought about it. I do read fiction in a serious way, as all writers have. But I think in some ways there's a certain kind of writing, whether we look at various Palestinian accounts or various Jewish accounts, or whether we look at Turks or Russian writers in Baghdad, for instance, or even Macho or the home. There's some things which I felt I couldn't really delve into fiction and work, because what was real, it was just so pressing. I couldn't call that person something else. I couldn't want to create a composite character, because the intensity of that reality. At times you just need to write it the way it is to be able to live. And I am a professional writer, and there are various things I write. What part could be, but I don't think I could have done without doing that. And there are books and there are things that you have that are necessary. Not just because you work in a particular profession, but they're necessary for your own being. It's a story all of us have, my friends, my generation, in Kashmir. That's all we talked about. I went to college in America. Never been to North India before, and there were very strange people. They wore different clothes, the language was different, the culture was very, very different. And that was also the first time I met a lot of young Kashmiri people from India. And the only